How do billionaire record label bosses destroy their rivals without getting blood on their tailored suits? Instead of fighting their own battles, corporate empires like Roc-A-Fella and Ruff Ryders use street-hardened artists as expendable mercenaries. In 2001, they manipulated Philadelphia enforcer Beanie Sigel and Yonkers lyrical assassin Jadakiss into a brutal manufactured war over market share. With no personal hatred between them, these two men were forced to broadcast deadly threats, pushing rival street factions to the brink of a real-world bloodbath. This is the ruthless reality of how record labels use Jadakiss and Beanie Sigel as pawns, leaving the artists to face prison and trauma while the executives counted their millions. But before these two immensely talented men were placed on the chessboard and turned into weapons for corporate gain, the executives had already rewritten the rules of the game. The late 1990s marked a terrifying and highly lucrative turning point. Hip-hop had transitioned from a localized cultural movement in the boroughs of New York into a multi-billion-dollar global industry. But this transition was baptized in blood. The murders of Tupac Shakur and Christopher Wallace, known as the notorious B.I.G., sent shockwaves through the industry. The executives in the glass towers of Manhattan learned a chilling lesson from these tragedies. Actual physical violence between top-tier stars was bad for business. Dead artists cannot tour. Dead artists cannot sell merchandise. However, the illusion of violence, the constant simmering threat of gang warfare, was the most profitable marketing tool ever invented. A power vacuum opened in New York following Wallace's death in 1997. The streets were looking for a new king, but the men who stepped up to claim the throne understood that true power no longer resided on the pavement. It resided in the boardroom. On one side of this divide was Roc-A-Fella Records, founded by the fiercely ambitious Damon Dash, Kareem Biggs Burke, and the calculating brilliant lyricist Sean Carter, known as Jay-Z. They were transitioning rapidly from street hustlers to corporate titans. Jay-Z was systematically changing the image of the rapper from a corner boy to a mafia don, trading sports jerseys for tailored suits and summering in the Hamptons. But there is a dangerous paradox in marketing street culture to the masses. The richer and more inaccessible you become, the more your core audience begins to doubt your authenticity. Jay-Z was becoming a billionaire. He could no longer credibly threaten to shoot someone over a perceived slight. He had too much to lose. He needed a shield. He needed someone whose mere presence would remind the world that Roc-A-Fella was still dangerous. 100 miles south in the fractured, violent neighborhoods of South Philadelphia, the Roc-A-Fella executives found their ultimate deterrent. His name was Dwight Equin Grant. Born in 1974, Grant would become known to the world as Beanie Sigel. He did not possess the polished, technical wizardry of his New York contemporaries. He did not care about elaborate rhyme schemes or radio-friendly choruses. Beanie was a force of raw, unadulterated trauma. He was an authentic product of a city that had been decimated by poverty, systemic neglect, and the crack cocaine epidemic. Philadelphia was not a glamorous place. It was a meat grinder. Beanie rapped with a menacing, slow drawl that made every lyric sound less like a performance and more like a sworn deposition. When he spoke of violence, it was not a metaphor. It was a recounting of his daily reality. Jay-Z saw the terrifying authenticity in Beanie Sigel and purchased it. When Beanie was signed to Roc-A-Fella in the late 1990s, he was not just signed as an artist, he was contracted as the muscle. He was the pit bull kept on a heavy chain, the enforcer whose very existence legitimized the street credibility of his billionaire boss. For Beanie, this was a lifeline out of the ghetto, but it was a deal with the devil. He was being paid handsomely, but he was being paid specifically to be dangerous. The corporate structure did not want him to heal from his trauma. They wanted to weaponize it. They needed him to remain angry, volatile, and perpetually ready to strike. While Roc-A-Fella was building its fortress in Manhattan, another empire was expanding just north of the city limits. Ruff Ryders Entertainment was a family-run powerhouse from Yonkers, managed by the Dean siblings, Wah, Chivon, and Dee. If Roc-A-Fella sold the image of the wealthy mafia don, Ruff Ryders sold the image of the militarized street gang. Their aesthetic was dirt bikes, pit bulls, camouflage, and brute force, built initially on the back of the gruff, electrifying energy of DMX. But DMX was an uncontrollable wildfire. Ruff Ryders needed a technician, a craftsman who could hold the line and command the absolute respect of the hip-hop purists. They had their weapon in Jason Terrence Phillips. Born in Yonkers in 1975, Phillips, known as Jadakiss, was a prodigy of rhythm and rhyme. He possessed a distinctively raspy voice and an uncanny ability to craft complex, devastating lyrical punchlines. Jadakiss was a student of the culture, a man who treated rapping like a martial art. But his psychological journey to the front line of the Ruff Ryders army was paved with its own distinct brand of corporate abuse. In the mid-1990s, Jadakiss and his group, the Locks, had been signed to Bad Boy Records run by Sean Puffy Combs. It was a lucrative contract on paper, but a creative prison in reality. Combs, a master marketer of shiny, pop-friendly hip-hop, forced the Locks to wear glossy suits and rap over upbeat, radio-friendly samples. For a technician like Jadakiss, who prided himself on gritty, hardcore lyricism, it was deeply humiliating. It was a daily assault on his artistic integrity and his street reputation. He was being paraded around like a dancing bear by a corporate master who owned his publishing rights and dictated his wardrobe. The Locks eventually fought a bitter, highly public, and physically threatening battle to win their freedom from Bad Boy. They staged protests, confronted executives, and put their careers on the line to escape the glossy corporate machine. When they finally broke free and signed with Ruff Ryders, Jadakiss was a changed man. He was fiercely protective of his independence and highly suspicious of industry manipulation. Yet he failed to realize that he had merely traded one corporate master for another. Ruff Ryders did not force him to wear shiny suits, but they did require him to be the vanguard of their empire. He was the jewel in their crown. He was their most respected, technically gifted artist. He just wanted to rap, but the system had positioned him as a soldier. As the calendar turned from 1999 to 2000, the stage was meticulously set. You had two massive corporate entities hoarding wealth and market share, glaring at each other across the industry landscape. And sitting in the barracks of these empires were two men who did not know each other, who had no personal vendetta, but who carried the crushing weight of their respective cities on their shoulders. Dwight Grant in Philadelphia was fighting to keep his family out of poverty, relying on his aggression to prove his worth to a boss who was rapidly outgrowing the streets. Jason Phillips in Yonkers was fighting to prove his lyrical supremacy, desperate to wash away the humiliation of his previous corporate contract and establish himself as the undisputed king of New York. They were two highly intelligent, deeply traumatized men standing on a chessboard. They believed they were fighting for their own honor, their own legacy, and their own survival. They could not see the hands of the executives hovering above them, preparing to move the pieces. The capitalists knew that a war was coming. They knew that a clash between New York and Philadelphia, between the lyrical assassin and the street pit bull, would generate millions of dollars in free publicity, record sales, and media engagement. All they needed was a spark. They needed a perceived slight, a bruised ego, a microscopic crack in the armor of either empire. The executives would not have to lift a finger to draw blood. They would simply point their mercenaries at each other, hand them the microphones, and let the machinery of pride and trauma do the rest. The countdown to the proxy war had begun, and the men who were about to bleed had no idea they were already casualties of the system. The spark that ignited this catastrophic proxy war was remarkably ordinary, rooted in the standard competitive boasting that had defined hip-hop since its inception. In the early 2000s, Jason Phillips, operating as Jadakiss, was riding a wave of immense critical acclaim. He was preparing to release his debut solo album, Kiss the Game Goodbye. To build anticipation, he utilized the standard marketing tool of the genre. He confidently declared himself the undisputed king of New York. He claimed lyrical supremacy, famously stating he was in the top 5, dead or alive. It was a boast, a flex of artistic muscle, and fundamentally a business tactic designed to move inventory for Ruff Ryders and their parent distributor, Interscope Records. But in the fragile, hyper-competitive ecosystem of the music industry, a boast is rarely taken as mere marketing. It is perceived as a territorial threat. Sitting in the corner office of Roc-A-Fella Records, Sean Jay-Z Carter heard the declaration and took offense. Jay-Z had spent the years following the death of the notorious B.I.G. meticulously positioning himself as the undisputed sovereign of the East Coast. He was moving millions of units. He was sitting at the table with corporate titans like Lear Cohen and Russell Simmons. He was building an empire that extended far beyond music into fashion, films, and liquor. Jadakiss's claim was a direct challenge to the Roc-A-Fella monopoly. However, Jay-Z faced a profound dilemma. He was transitioning into a billionaire. He was attempting to cultivate an image of untouchable corporate sophistication. If he personally engaged in a vicious, mud-slinging contest with a gritty Yonkers street rapper, he risked tarnishing that carefully curated image. Engaging in a street-level feud was bad for corporate synergy. It spooked investors. It threatened distribution deals. Jay-Z had a fiduciary duty to his own wealth to remain above the fray. Yet the challenge could not be ignored. In the business of selling street authenticity, silence is interpreted as weakness, and weakness destroys market share. The solution was the oldest mechanism of imperial power. The executive does not dirty his hands. He issues a mandate to the trenches. That mandate fell squarely on Dwight Grant. To understand why Beanie accepted this assignment with such ferocity, one must understand the absolute unyielding nature of survival loyalty. Beanie was a man who had been plucked from the crushing poverty and systemic violence of South Philadelphia. Roc-A-Fella had given him a lifeline, a multi-million-dollar contract and a sense of belonging. To a man conditioned by the streets, you owe your life to the entity that feeds you. The label executives understood this trauma bond perfectly. They did not need to force Beanie to attack Jadakiss. They merely had to suggest that the Roc-A-Fella family was being disrespected. Beanie Sigel wasn't just ordered to attack. His own unwavering street-level loyalty compelled him to defend the Roc-A-Fella crest. While there was no historical bad blood with Jason Phillips, any perceived slight against his crew was enough to ignite his aggression. The corporate mandate didn't create his violence. It simply handed it a microphone. Beanie entered the recording studio, a facility paid for by Roc-A-Fella's parent company, Def Jam. He stood in front of a microphone, engineered by highly paid technicians, and began to manufacture a lethal weapon. He recorded a track that was not merely competitive. It was a deeply personal, aggressive assault on Jadakiss's character, his street credibility, and his physical safety. The corporate machinery immediately took over. The executives did not release this track quietly. They utilized their massive promotional budgets to press the song onto exclusive mixtapes, funneling them through powerful street-level DJs like DJ Clue. They ensured the track bypassed standard release protocols and hit the pavement with maximum impact. This is where the complicity of the media apparatus becomes undeniable. The record labels could manufacture the weapon, but they needed an arms dealer to distribute it. That role was eagerly filled by the commercial radio stations, most notably New York's Hot 97. Hot 97, owned by the massive media conglomerate Emmys Communications, was the epicenter of hip-hop culture at the time. But the executives sitting in the station's boardrooms were not cultural curators. They were capitalists driven purely by ratings and advertising revenue. When the Beanie Sigel diss track landed on their desks, they did not see a dangerous escalation of gang-affiliated rhetoric. They saw a ratings goldmine. Conflict commands human attention, and attention dictates the price of a 30-second advertising slot. The station put the track on heavy rotation. The radio hosts, acting as highly paid instigators, dissected the lyrics on air. They treated the threats of violence as a spectator sport, asking listeners to call in and vote on who was winning the war. They goaded the artists, questioning their manhood and their street credibility, to an audience of millions across the tri-state area. The radio station transformed a manufactured corporate dispute into a public gladiatorial death match. They monetized the very real risk of bloodshed. Sitting in Yonkers, Jason Phillips heard the track echoing through the radio waves, and he realized the trap that had been set for him. Jadakiss was an intelligent, analytical man. He likely recognized the corporate maneuvering behind the sudden hostility from Philadelphia. But recognizing the trap does not mean you can escape it. Jadakiss was cornered by the very street code that the music industry had commodified. If he ignored Beanie Sigel's assault, he would be publicly branded a coward. In the ecosystem of hardcore hip-hop, a coward cannot sell records. If his record sales plummeted, the Ruff Ryders empire would suffer a massive financial blow. The Dean family, his employers and his brethren, relied on him to carry the brand. He had thousands of people, from executives to street-level distributors to his own entourage, relying on his reputation to feed their families. He was stripped of his autonomy. He could not walk away, call the police, or settle the matter in a boardroom. The system demanded blood, or at least the convincing promise of it. Jadakiss returned to the studio. He was forced to draft a response that matched the venom and the physical threats of his opponent. The psychological toll of this requirement is rarely discussed, but it is profound. These men were not writing fiction. They were drafting lyrics that could easily serve as the catalyst for their own obituaries. They were putting targets on their own backs to satisfy a demographic of consumers who wanted the thrill of authentic violence without any of the actual risk. When Jadakiss released his retaliatory tracks, the proxy war officially shifted from a localized dispute into a massive, multi-city mobilization. The executives at Roc-A-Fella and Ruff Ryders watched the sales metrics spike. The controversy was working precisely as designed. The music press printed sensationalized headlines, treating the feud as the greatest story of the year. The CEOs counted the massive influx of capital. But down on the asphalt, the temperature was reaching a boiling point. The words spoken in the air-conditioned studios in Manhattan were having terrifying real-world consequences in the impoverished neighborhoods of two major cities. This was the brutal reality of weaponizing street culture. The artists were tethered to massive networks of neighborhood loyalists. In Yonkers, the factions aligned with Ruff Ryders took the insults against Jadakiss as a direct attack on their community. In Philadelphia, the sprawling underworld connected to Beanie Sigel viewed the retaliation as an act of war against their city. The corporate executives had successfully mobilized private armies without spending a single dollar on traditional recruitment. The threat of physical violence mutated from a marketing strategy into a daily, suffocating reality. The interstate highway connecting New York and Philadelphia, the I-95 corridor, became a tense, heavily monitored boundary line. When either artist traveled, they did so in heavily armed convoys. Nightclubs, music video shoots, and public appearances became high-risk security operations. The artists had to employ dozens of men just to ensure they survived the promotional tours for the very records the labels were profiting from. The system is fundamentally cruel because it entirely insulates the architects of the violence from the consequences of the violence. If a shootout had occurred at a nightclub, resulting in the death of Jadakiss or Beanie Sigel, Damon Dash, Jay-Z, and the Dean family would not have faced criminal conspiracy charges. They would not have gone to prison. They would have issued carefully drafted press releases expressing their deep sorrow, attended the heavily publicized funerals, and then immediately capitalized on the surge in posthumous album sales. The legal and physical liability was shouldered entirely by the working-class mercenaries. For Dwight Grant, the psychological burden of this corporate mandate was becoming unbearable. Beanie Sigel was not just asked to record aggressive music, he was required to embody the persona of a rabid attack dog 24 hours a day. The human mind cannot sustain that level of hypervigilance and manufactured rage without fracturing. Roc-A-Fella required Beanie to be the monster in the room. When he attended corporate meetings, when he walked through airports, when he stopped at a gas station, the public expected the violent enforcer they heard on the radio. The label rewarded this behavior. They celebrated his aggression because it validated their brand. But this validation is a psychological poison. It actively discourages healing. It traps the artist in a perpetual state of trauma response. convincing them that their only value to the world is their capacity for violence. Beanie was effectively trapped in his own persona. The industry demanded a frontline soldier, and he delivered, absorbing the paranoia and the constant threat of retaliation, while the media gleefully broadcasted his psychological unraveling as pure entertainment. The stage was set for a catastrophic collapse, one that the corporate bosses would watch safely from their penthouse suites, their hands completely clean, while the men they weaponized marched blindly toward the abyss. War is an astonishingly expensive endeavor, but the most insidious secret of the music industry's proxy wars is that the corporate generals do not pay for the ammunition. The foot soldiers do. As the calendar moved deep into 2001, the manufactured hostility between Jadakiss and Beanie Sigel escalated from radio subliminals into a full-scale tactical deployment. To understand the sheer cruelty of this system, you must examine the financial mechanics of how these artists were forced to survive the very war their employers initiated. The executives at Roc-A-Fella and Ruff Ryders demanded a hostile public spectacle, but they did not absorb the physical risk. Consequently, the artists had to militarize their own lives. When Jadakiss and Beanie Sigel moved through the I-95 corridor, they no longer traveled like musicians. They traveled like heads of state in hostile territories. They required bulletproof SUVs. They needed convoys of security personnel, consisting of off-duty police officers and street-hardened loyalists from their respective neighborhoods. They needed safe houses, specialized logistics, and constant surveillance. This level of security requires massive amounts of capital. However, the record labels did not write a blank check to protect their artists. In the draconian accounting structures of the music business, security is categorized as a recoupable expense. The label advances the money to hire the bodyguards and rent the armored vehicles, but that debt is strapped directly to the artist's royalty account. The brutal irony of this corporate warfare was that survival itself became a recoupable expense. Every time Beanie Sigel hired a bodyguard, the label advanced the money, driving him deeper into debt. Every time Jadakiss fortified his movements to avoid a Philadelphia ambush, his profit margin shrank, surrendering more control back to the executives in Yonkers. The system trapped them in a cycle of debt and danger, ensuring that the harder they fought, the tighter their chains became. In the recording booths, the lyrical exchanges became surgical and ruthlessly direct. Jadakiss, operating under the immense financial pressure of carrying the Ruff Ryders brand, while their flagship artist, DMX, battled his own severe personal demons, delivered his response. He walked into the studios of Hot 97 and delivered a devastating a cappella freestyle aimed squarely at Beanie Sigel and the entire Roc-A-Fella roster. It was a masterclass in technical rapping. He systematically dismantled Beanie's credibility, questioning his autonomy and mocking his position as a subordinate to Jay-Z. From a purely competitive standpoint, Jadakiss had executed a flawless tactical strike, but the emotional cost was severe. Jason Phillips was a purist. He loved the art of hip-hop. He wanted to be recognized for his craftsmanship, his breath control, and his vocabulary. Instead, he was forced to spend his prime creative years operating as a corporate hitman. The psychological drain of constantly looking over his shoulder in his own city of New York began to alter his demeanor. The The stoicism he displayed to the public was a necessary armor. He could not show fatigue because in the environment the labels had curated, fatigue invited death. He had to maintain the posture of a stone-cold killer, even as he recognized the fundamental absurdity of risking his life over a billionaire's bruised ego. For Dwight Grant, the situation in Philadelphia was rapidly deteriorating from a high-pressure marketing campaign into a profound psychological collapse. Beanie Sigel was not built for the calculated, cynical game of corporate chess. He was a man who operated on visceral loyalty and street-level absolute truths. When Roc-A-Fella told him to attack Jadakiss, Beanie did not view it as a promotional rollout. He internalized the conflict. He believed the war was real because, in his environment, words always had immediate violent consequences. The cognitive dissonance demanded of Beanie Sigel was fundamentally unsustainable. During the day, he was expected to sit in air-conditioned boardrooms in Manhattan, shaking hands with European distribution executives and drinking expensive champagne with Damon Dash and Jay-Z. By night, he was expected to return to the fractured streets of Philadelphia and maintain the terrifying persona of the Broad Street bully. You cannot ask a traumatized man to play a monster for the cameras and then expect him to turn it off when the red light stops blinking. The aggression the label rewarded in the vocal booth bled directly into his daily existence. Beanie became hypervigilant, paranoid, and increasingly reliant on the mechanisms of street survival. He was carrying unregistered firearms. He was engaging in physical altercations. He was surrounding himself with individuals deeply entrenched in the criminal underworld because the corporate entity had convinced him that his life was in imminent danger from rival New York factions. The record label executives were completely aware of Beanie's deteriorating mental state and his dangerous behavior. They possessed the resources to intervene. They could have hired therapists, relocated him to a secure environment, or publicly de-escalated the feud with Ruff Ryders. They chose to do absolutely nothing. In fact, the system actively profited from his downward spiral. The more erratic and dangerous Beanie Sigel became in real life, the more his albums sold. His genuine legal troubles and violent outbursts served as an unpaid, highly effective marketing campaign for Roc-A-Fella Records. It proved to the suburban consumer that the danger they were purchasing on compact disc was completely authentic. The capitalists transformed Dwight Grant's trauma into a commodity, mining his sanity to inflate their quarterly earnings. As the summer of 2001 approached, the tension between the two factions reached a critical mass. The media apparatus continued to fan the flames. Hip-hop magazines ran side-by-side comparisons of the two artists, effectively acting as combat sports promoters. Radio DJs debated who would win in a physical altercation. The industry was actively salivating at the prospect of violence, entirely insulated from the blood that would inevitably stain the pavement. But the constant, intense public scrutiny brought a new, far more dangerous element into the proxy war: the federal government. Law enforcement agencies in New York and Pennsylvania were not blind to the corporate-sponsored gang warfare dominating the airwaves. The New York Police Department had already established an intelligence unit specifically designed to monitor the rap industry, infamously known as the hip-hop police. They tracked the movements of artists, monitored their entourages, and documented the escalating threats broadcast on commercial radio. The proxy war, had drawn a massive, highly coordinated law enforcement target onto the backs of both Jadakiss and Beanie Sigel. The executives at Roc-A-Fella and Ruff Ryders were aware of the police surveillance. Their high-priced corporate attorneys undoubtedly advised them of the legal risks. But the executives were shielded by the corporate veil. If a federal indictment came down, it would not target the boardroom. It would target the artists. The system allowed the billionaires to reap the financial rewards of the feud while outsourcing 100% of the criminal liability to their working-class employees. Jadakiss, utilizing his deep understanding of survival, managed to navigate the surveillance with a disciplined, calculated caution. He kept his circle tight, restricted his movements, and ensured his immediate entourage remained disciplined. He understood that the authorities were waiting for a single misstep to dismantle the Ruff Ryders organization from the bottom up. Beanie Sigel, however, was already drowning. The pressure to act as the vanguard for Jay-Z's empire had shattered his discipline. The paranoid reality constructed by his employers pushed him into a corner where violence felt like the only reliable defense mechanism. In the streets of Philadelphia, altercations escalated. Rumors of shootings and retaliations linked to Beanie's camp began to circulate with terrifying frequency. The contrast between the mercenary and the monarch during this specific time frame is stark and unforgiving. In September of 2001, Jay-Z released The Blueprint, an album largely considered a masterful, untouchable classic. It solidified his status as a legendary artist and a transcendent corporate entity. He was insulated, wealthy, and universally praised. He had successfully used Beanie Sigel to hold the aggressive front line, keeping his own hands pristine while he ascended to the absolute peak of the industry. Simultaneously, the walls were closing in on Dwight Grant. The reality of the streets, amplified by the expectations of the boardroom, finally caught up with him. He was not untouchable. He was a highly visible, heavily surveilled target carrying the weight of a manufactured war. The local police and federal agencies began to tighten their net. The illusion of corporate protection was about to evaporate. Beanie Sigel was about to learn the most devastating lesson of the proxy war. The record label will pay for your studio time. They will pay for your music videos, and they will gladly monetize your threats. But when the flashing red and blue lights appear in the rearview mirror and the heavy steel doors of the justice system swing open, the executives do not stand beside you in the courtroom. You face the judge entirely alone. The collision between corporate fiction and federal reality is entirely unforgiving. When billionaires manufacture a proxy war, they deal in the currency of public relations, chart positions, and media narratives. But when the justice system intervenes, it deals strictly in the currency of physical bodies and concrete cells. As the early 2000s progressed, the carefully orchestrated conflict between Roc-A-Fella Records and Ruff Ryders exited the radio waves and slammed violently into the American penal system. For Dwight Grant, the descent was absolute. The corporate mandate that required him to embody the Broad Street bully 24 hours a day had completely eroded his ability to navigate the real world safely. You cannot condition a man to react to every perceived slight with overwhelming aggression and then expect him to adhere to the penal code. Roc-A-Fella had demanded a monster, and Beanie Sigel delivered one. But the label executives did not live in his Philadelphia neighborhood. They did not have to navigate the paranoid, hyper-violent ecosystem they had paid him to project. Between 2002 and 2004, the trap snapped shut. Beanie Sigel became entangled in a devastating web of legal catastrophes. He was arrested and charged with attempted murder in Philadelphia following a violent altercation outside a nightclub. Shortly after, federal authorities indicted him on federal weapons and drug charges. He was facing decades in a penitentiary. This is the exact moment the proxy war reveals its most sinister mechanic, the privatization of profit and the individualization of liability. When Beanie Sigel was generating millions of dollars by threatening Jadakiss and securing the street credibility of the Roc-A-Fella empire, he was treated as an indispensable corporate asset. He flew on private jets. He was flanked by executives. But when the heavy steel doors of the federal courthouse swung open, the executives vanished. Damon Dash and Jay-Z did not stand beside him at the defense table. They did not face the judge to explain that they had heavily incentivized, marketed, and profited from the very aggression that led to these charges. Dwight Grant stood alone. The corporate response to Beanie Sigel's incarceration is a masterclass in capitalist exploitation. Roc-A-Fella Records did not halt their operations to mourn the loss of their primary soldier. Instead, they immediately monetized his absence. The label launched the Free Beanie marketing campaign. They printed thousands of t-shirts. They explicitly used his impending prison sentence as a promotional tool to push the sales of his next album, The Becoming. It is a profound psychological betrayal. The corporation had weaponized his trauma, marched him into a federal cage, and then set up a cash register outside his prison cell. Beanie Sigel was locked in a 6x9 concrete box, fighting for his life and his freedom, while suburban teenagers purchased free Beanie merchandise, funneling revenue directly back to the executives in Manhattan. His loss of liberty was simply converted into a new revenue stream. 100 miles away, Jason Phillips watched the destruction of his rival with a cold, terrifying clarity. Jadakiss was a survivor. He possessed the intellect to read the board and see precisely how the pieces were being sacrificed. He watched Beanie Sigel, a man he essentially shared a profession and a background with, get swallowed whole by the justice system, while the corporate bosses continued to prosper. Jadakiss also recognized the precarious nature of his own position. Ruff Ryders, the mighty Yonkers empire that had deployed him as their lyrical assassin, was beginning to fracture. The intense financial drain of maintaining a massive roster, combined with the erratic behavior and severe legal issues of their flagship artist, DMX, was bleeding the label dry. The infrastructure was crumbling. Jadakiss realized that if he made a single misstep, if he allowed the manufactured hostility of the proxy war to push him into a real-world violent confrontation, he would face the exact same fate as Beanie Sigel. Ruff Ryders would not be able to save him from a federal indictment. The realization triggered a profound tactical shift. Jadakiss refused to be a casualty of another man's empire building. He recognized that the beef with Beanie Sigel was a dead end. It was a corporate meat grinder that offered no true reward for the soldier, only risk. In 2004, Jadakiss released his second solo album, Kiss of Death. The lead single was not a violent threat aimed at a rival artist. It was a track titled Why, a deeply introspective, politically charged song that questioned the systemic failures of American society, the hypocrisy of the government, and the structural traps laid out for young black men. It was a massive commercial and critical success. This pivot was not accidental. It was a survival strategy. By shifting his lyrical focus from localized gang warfare to broader social commentary, Jadakiss effectively disarmed the proxy war. He elevated himself above the street-level conflict that Jay-Z and Roc-A-Fella had tried to trap him in. He proved that he could generate massive revenue and cultural impact without operating as a corporate hitman. He reclaimed his autonomy. Meanwhile, the generals who had orchestrated the war were moving to higher ground. The mid-2000s marked the permanent ascension of the record label executives out of the streets and into the global corporate elite. In 2004, the Roc-A-Fella empire was officially sold to Island Def Jam. The partnership between Damon Dash and Jay-Z dissolved in a highly publicized, bitter corporate divorce. Damon Dash walked away with millions, pivoting into fashion and film. Jay-Z's trajectory was even more calculated. He did not just sell his company, he became the president and CEO of Def Jam Recordings. He transitioned from a rapper into a global executive, donning a suit and tie, sitting at the head of a multi-billion-dollar international conglomerate. The proxy war was officially obsolete. Jay-Z no longer needed Beanie Sigel to bark at his rivals. He no longer needed to prove his street credibility to the demographic in Philadelphia or Yonkers. He was negotiating with international tech companies and global brands. The street beefs that had built his empire were now considered corporate liabilities. The scaffolding had served its purpose. The skyscraper was built and the tools were carelessly discarded. Beanie Sigel eventually emerged from federal prison into an industry that had completely moved on without him. The Roc-A-Fella family he had bled for was dead. The executives who had fueled his rage had changed their phone numbers and their tax brackets. He was a gladiator returning to an empty coliseum. He was left with a felony record, severe trauma, and the crushing realization that his loyalty had been entirely unrequited. It was in the quiet aftermath of this corporate abandonment that the final chapter of the Jadakiss and Beanie Sigel feud was written. It did not happen on the radio. It was not orchestrated by Hot 97 to boost advertising rates. It was not sponsored by a record label. The two men eventually crossed paths, stripped of the corporate mandates, devoid of the aggressive marketing campaigns. They simply looked at one another as men. They had both survived the exact same meat grinder. Jadakiss looked at Beanie and saw a man who had paid the ultimate price for playing the game. Beanie looked at Jadakiss and saw a peer who had smart enough to step off the tracks before the train hit him. They shook hands. They squashed the feud immediately and permanently. There was no grand public apology because they both understood the unspoken truth. Their anger had never truly belonged to them. It belonged to the board of directors. They had been manipulated into despising a mirror image of themselves to generate wealth for men who viewed them as expendable assets. The handshake between Jadakiss and Beanie Sigel was not just a peace treaty. It was a silent acknowledgement of mutual exploitation. It was the profound, tragic realization of two mercenaries who finally understood that they had been aiming their weapons in the wrong direction the entire time. They had fought a war for kings who had already abandoned the castle. The silence that follows a proxy war is often more devastating than the conflict itself. When the executives have tallied their profits, dismantled the marketing campaigns, and moved their investments into safer, more lucrative portfolios, the mercenaries are left standing in the rubble. For Dwight Grant and Jason Phillips, the immediate aftermath of their manufactured feud was not a period of celebration. It was a period of profound, irreversible attrition. They had survived the immediate threat of violence, but they were about to face the crushing reality of corporate obsolescence. To understand the full tragic scope of this exploitation, one must look at the physical and psychological toll exacted on these men in the decades that followed. When two empires collide, the foot soldiers absorb the kinetic energy of the impact. The executives at Roc-A-Fella and Ruff Ryders had successfully used their artists to block each other's market dominance, but the structural integrity of both labels was fundamentally compromised by the effort. In Yonkers, the Ruff Ryders empire was slowly collapsing under the weight of its own internal tragedies. The label had been built on a foundation of raw, unfiltered street authenticity, heavily reliant on the singular, explosive energy of DMX. But authenticity in the music industry often means unmanaged trauma. As DMX's personal demons and severe addiction issues consumed him, the financial infrastructure of Ruff Ryders began to buckle. Jason Phillips, the loyal lyrical technician, was left standing on the deck of a sinking ship. He had spent the prime years of his commercial viability defending the Ruff Ryders crest against Roc-A-Fella. He had dutifully played the role of the assassin, navigating the surveillance of the hip-hop police and the genuine threats of street retaliation. But loyalty to a corporation is a one-way street. When Ruff Ryders lost their distribution leverage and the corporate funding dried up, Jadakiss was forced to rebuild his career practically from scratch. He possessed the intellect and the sheer technical talent to survive, transitioning into a highly respected elder statesman of the genre. But the prime of his career, the years where he should have been ascending to the absolute pinnacle of global stardom, were hijacked. He was forced to spend his optimal creative years fighting a defensive war for a company that ultimately could not protect its own legacy. He survived, but survival is not the same as victory. He walked away with his life and his respect, but the billionaires had siphoned off his momentum. For Dwight Grant, the aftermath was not merely a loss of momentum, it was a complete, systematic destruction of his life. When Beanie Sigel emerged from federal prison, the landscape of the music industry had shifted permanently. The Roc-A-Fella dynasty, the family he had literally risked his freedom to defend, was gone. The executives had fractured the company in a bitter dispute over money and corporate titles. Damon Dash had been ousted. Jay-Z had ascended to the presidency of Def Jam Recording, donning tailored suits and cultivating a pristine, corporate-friendly image that had absolutely no room for a convicted felon with a reputation for unpredictable violence. The abandonment of Beanie Sigel is one of the most glaring examples of labor exploitation in modern entertainment history. He had been the attack dog. He had taken the federal charges. He had maintained the street credibility that allowed his bosses to secure multi-million-dollar lifestyle brands. But when his usefulness expired, he was discarded with terrifying efficiency. He was left to navigate the world with a felony record, a fractured career, and the severe psychological scars of a man who realized His absolute loyalty had been a one-sided illusion. The trauma of being a discarded weapon does not simply fade. It manifests in a desperate, often destructive cycle of survival. Over the next decade, Beanie Sigel struggled to find his footing. He released music independently, but the massive corporate machine that had once amplified his voice was now actively ignoring him. He drifted back into the perilous environments the label had initially paid him to represent. In 2014, the violent reality he was forced to commodify finally caught up with him physically. During an altercation in New Jersey, Dwight Grant was shot in the torso. The bullet tore through his body, resulting in the removal of one of his lungs. This catastrophic injury is the ultimate heartbreaking metaphor for his entire career. The system took a man with a booming, commanding voice, used him to shout threats at their rivals, and then left him in a position where he would eventually lose his very ability to breathe. His vocal cords were permanently damaged. The menacing, thunderous drawl that Roc-A-Fella had packaged and sold to millions of suburban teenagers was reduced to a raspy, labored whisper. He gave his lungs to the empire, and the empire left him to pay the medical bills. When we examine the historical consequences of the Jadakiss and Beanie Sigel conflict, it becomes clear that the music industry learned a great deal from this era. However, they did not learn morality. They learned efficiency. The blueprint established in 2001, weaponizing the trauma of young men from impoverished neighborhoods to drive engagement and sales, has not been dismantled. It has been streamlined. If you look at the modern landscape of the music industry, particularly the rise of drill music in Chicago, London, and New York, you see the exact same corporate mechanics at play, only accelerated. Major record labels, owned by massive multinational conglomerates, are actively signing teenagers who are deeply entrenched in active, lethal gang conflicts. The labels do not intervene to stop the violence. They fund the music videos. They market the rivalries on social media. They use the very real, terrifyingly high murder rate among these young artists as a verifiable stamp of authenticity to sell streaming subscriptions. The executives today do not even need the artists to engage in radio interviews to stoke the tension. The proxy wars are fought in real time on social media platforms, broadcast directly to millions of consumers who treat the deaths of these young men as interactive entertainment. The lifespan of the modern mercenary is significantly shorter than it was in 2001, but the profit margins for the corporations are higher than ever. The system has simply become better at extracting the wealth before the artist is either incarcerated or killed. This is why the story of Jadakiss and Beanie Sigel remains so vitally important. It strips away the glamour and the mythology of the street narrative and exposes the cold, clinical machinery of corporate capitalism. It proves that the men pulling the triggers and writing the diss tracks are not the architects of their own demise. They are the ammunition. They are trapped in a socioeconomic vice, offered a desperate way out of poverty, but only on the condition that they monetize their own destruction. When Jadakiss and Beanie Sigel eventually crossed paths years later and shook hands, it was a profound moment of clarity. It was two veterans standing on a battlefield long after the war had ended, realizing that the flags they had been fighting for were entirely meaningless. They had allowed billionaires to manipulate their pride, their environment, and their survival instincts. They had viewed each other as the enemy, when in reality they were simply two workers being exploited by the exact same factory. Their reconciliation was a quiet, dignified rejection of the system that had tried to kill them for profit. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. The time, the peace of mind, and the physical health they lost could never be returned to them. The proxy war between Jadakiss and Beanie Sigel is not a story about the triumph of hip-hop. It is a grim, unvarnished lesson in the mechanics of power and the ruthlessness of corporate exploitation. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Systems of immense wealth are rarely built on innovation alone. They are built on the strategic consumption of the vulnerable. The record label executives understood that the most effective way to eliminate a rival is to convince the working class to destroy each other. They took two highly intelligent, deeply traumatized men from Yonkers and Philadelphia and weaponized their pride. They transformed systemic poverty into a lucrative marketing campaign, entirely insulating themselves from the legal and physical consequences. When the dust settled, the architects of the conflict ascended to the absolute pinnacle of global wealth, untouched by the law and celebrated by high society. The men they used to build their thrones were left to navigate federal prisons, collapsing infrastructures, and life-altering physical injuries. The ultimate tragedy of this era is the realization that in the corporate theater of war, the mercenary never wins the crown. They simply bleed to ensure the emperor keeps his hands clean. The handshake between Jadakiss and Beanie Sigel remains a powerful, lingering testament to their survival. Two men who finally stopped fighting each other, only to realize the true enemy had already left the building.